Washington, D.C. A name that makes the whole world immediately think of power, of decisions that change the fate of the globe. Newspapers and television often show us images of the gleaming White House under the sun, the solemn Capitol, grand avenues lined with flags and proud monuments. But behind that magnificent curtain, there exists a completely different Washington, a Washington that few have ever seen with their own eyes. Right under the overpasses, just a few steps away from the most powerful institutions on the planet, thousands of people live in tattered tents, huddled in the freezing night. While tourists are busy taking pictures at the Lincoln Memorial, not far away there are people who only wish to find a spot to spend the night. This is not the Washington woven into the American dream. This is the Washington of sighs, of desperate eyes, and of lives abandoned right in the nation's capital. And in this video, for the first time, you will see a city of stark contrasts, where the symbols of democracy and freedom stand side by side with streets filled with tents, where light and shadow collide with every breath. A truth never revealed by the media, and a truth we must face. Washington, D.C. The powerful capital of the United States has long been known for its splendid buildings, historic monuments, and the radiance of the American dream. But alongside that glamorous picture, another story has quietly unfolded since the early 20th century. Makeshift camps of veterans returning from war and poor immigrant workers. They carried with them the hope of changing their lives, but ultimately erected tents of tarpaulin and scrap wood right on the edge of the capital of power. After World War II, Washington entered a phase of urban expansion. New neighborhoods arose, modern and comfortable, but reserved only for the white middle class. Discriminatory housing policies forced communities of color and poor families into rundown areas near the city center. The phenomenon of redlining, discriminatory lending, became a scar stretching across generations, as banks refused loans, forcing thousands of families to live in precarious conditions without any opportunity to improve their lives. Moving into the 1970s, industrial decline swept across America, leaving countless workers unemployed. At the same time, the federal government cut welfare budgets, especially in healthcare and social services. Mental hospitals closed, and the promise of community care never became reality, leaving thousands of patients wandering the streets. The capital's roads, parks, and underpasses quickly turned into reluctant shelters. By the 1990s, Washington, D.C. had become one of the cities with the highest homelessness density in the United States. The image of million-dollar mansions in Georgetown, only a few blocks from where the poor lit fires to cook on the sidewalks, became a symbol of profound inequality. Every public space once built to honor the ideals of democracy turned into an open-air shelter, where lives pushed to society's margins struggled to survive. This story is not just a wrinkle in urban history, but also proof of a collective political choice. Instead of protecting the vulnerable, society became accustomed to turning its back. And that very legacy laid the foundation for today's homelessness crisis in Washington, D.C. Faced with this prolonged crisis, Washington, D.C. has not been inactive. For decades, the city has experimented with all kinds of programs, from temporary housing to social support. But most of those efforts became stuck in a maze of bureaucracy, lacked coordination, and their outcomes rarely went beyond patchwork fixes. In 2022, Mayor Muriel Bowser was forced to declare a state of emergency. As the numbers of homeless people skyrocketed after the pandemic, the government made use of vacant hotels, turning them into temporary housing. This solution brought short-term hope for thousands of people, giving them a roof to endure the harsh winter. But in essence, it was only an emergency measure. By 2023, about 6,500 people had temporary shelter, yet the entire city still had more than 8,000 people continuing to sleep on sidewalks or in tattered tents. That figure is like a mirror reflecting the system's helplessness. When one person is sheltered, another is left outside on the margins. Local laws have also been adjusted to reduce harshness. Minor violations such as sleeping on benches or setting up tents in parks have gradually been decriminalized. The goal is to support reintegration rather than punishment. However, the support centers are already overloaded, with insufficient staff, so even with humane policies, the actual effectiveness remains limited. Another root cause lies in urban planning. For decades, DC's housing development policies prioritized low-density, isolated neighborhoods and restricted the construction of high-density housing near wealthy areas. Only recently has the city begun to adjust, but immediately it faced fierce opposition from upper-class residents, those who feared that the appearance of social housing projects would bring property devaluation or change the face of their neighborhoods. Many plans were therefore stalled, and the dream of affordable housing remained only on paper. Meanwhile, federal programs such as Housing First have proven effective. Simply by giving a person a stable apartment, they gain a foundation to find work, access health care, and gradually reintegrate. In D.C., this policy has significantly reduced the number of homeless veterans, people who once sacrificed for the country. But that effectiveness is limited by high costs, scarce resources, and poor coordination across different levels of government. Another pathway is federal housing vouchers, Section 8, considered a ticket to reopen the door to a home. Yet limited supply means this system only meets a small fraction of the need. Tens of thousands remain on waiting lists that stretch for years, with many losing the patience and strength to wait their turn. These countermeasures, on the surface, make it seem like the city is trying to cope. But in reality, it is only a slow race between two numbers. Each tent that is taken down is quickly replaced by another being erected. And this very repetition shows that D.C. is still trapped in a closed circle, extinguishing fires at single points, but never addressing the roots of the problem. In Washington, D.C., there exists a cruel paradox. Having a job does not mean having housing. The nation's capital, home to countless federal agencies, law firms, research institutes, and luxury restaurants, is also where tens of thousands of workers still face the risk of losing their homes even while working full-time. The minimum wage in D.C. never keeps pace with the exploding rent crisis. A small studio apartment, which in many other cities is just a starting point for singles, in D.C. costs an average of $1,900 per month in 2023. That figure is double the income from a minimum wage job, turning the dream of an independent home into a luxury. Nearly 40% of low-income workers are forced to spend most of their earnings on rent, many having to choose between a full meal and a stable place to sleep. These bitter choices repeat again and again, and when they can no longer manage, the sidewalk becomes their only roof. Home prices are no more forgiving. A small apartment or house in D.C. costs nearly $700,000 on average, several times higher than the median household income. Instead of building affordable housing to meet demand, real estate developers focus on luxury condo projects, where a penthouse can be worth millions, overlooking the sparkling lights of the Potomac River. Meanwhile, ordinary families can only look from afar, knowing that gap is impossible to cross. The elderly are among the most severely affected groups. With pensions averaging only about $1,200 a month, many seniors cannot afford rent. Over 20% of the homeless population in Washington, D.C. today are over 55, a heartbreaking statistic when imagining those who once contributed their whole lives now curled up on park benches at night. They carry with them a bag of medicine, a few clothes, and memories of a life that once had a home. Added to this are rising healthcare costs and the shocks of sudden job loss. One hospital stay can wipe out meager savings. One layoff can push an entire family onto the streets. In a housing market as unforgiving as D.C.'s, even a small setback is enough to plunge people directly into homelessness. The real estate market in the capital, with the glow of development, in reality operates like a machine of exclusion. It continuously pushes the vulnerable to the margins, leaving them with no place in the very city they helped build. And this cold mechanism has turned Washington, D.C. into a place where having a job is no longer a shield against life on the streets. If the housing market has pushed thousands onto the streets, then the healthcare system has trapped them in despair. In Washington, D.C., nearly half of the homeless struggle with mental illness or addiction. But instead of being treated, many are left abandoned on the streets, where the sound of car horns replaces words of concern, and park benches become makeshift hospital beds. In 2024, the capital still lacked thousands of psychiatric treatment beds. Demand far exceeds supply, and the healthcare system, already strained, is overwhelmed. Hospitals are forced to choose who gets treatment and who must return to a flimsy tent. Medical personnel are scarce, especially in low-income areas where patients need help the most. Meanwhile, the rate of drug addiction, particularly fentanyl, is rising rapidly like an underground flood, sweeping away whatever fragile opportunities remain. Deaths from overdoses have surged in recent years, leaving behind dry numbers in reports, but in reality, They are silent deaths, without funerals, without farewells. Detox beds currently meet less than 5% of actual demand. This means that for every person who finds a treatment spot, dozens of others must return to the streets where the temptation of the next hit is always right before them. Veterans, those who once wore the uniform to defend the country, make up a large share of this group. They often carry the scars of PTSD, haunted nightly by the memories of war, but lack transitional services and long-term care. They fought on the battlefield to defend freedom, only to return and continue fighting the darkness inside their own minds, this time without comrades by their side. Complicated bureaucracy only deepens the divide. Many are excluded from support programs simply for lacking an ID, something they may have lost during the most recent clearing of encampments. The medical door, already small, closes completely before those who need it most. The healthcare system in Washington, D.C., instead of being a safety net, resembles a leaking life preserver. It floats in the current but cannot support, leaving people floundering in waves of illness, poverty, and despair. And that very absence has turned sickness and addiction into a life sentence without escape for thousands of homeless lives in the capital. On the streets of Washington, D.C., the life of the homeless is not only a battle against cold or hunger. It is also a silent struggle against fear, violence, and insecurity that surrounds them hour by hour. When night falls and the city glows brightly around the White House and Capitol Hill, in parks and underpasses, hundreds of homeless women lie close together to protect themselves from predators in the dark. They rarely dare to sleep deeply, only dozing off amid the hum of traffic, always ready to wake at the slightest unusual sound. Transgender people and other vulnerable communities face double discrimination. Many shelters refuse to take them in, citing a lack of suitable facilities. As a result, they are forced onto the streets, easy targets for violence. Meanwhile, the threat of human trafficking and sexual exploitation lurks behind the neon lights of bars or in dark alleys. For many women, each passing day is another gamble, and not everyone wins the harsh game of survival. To make a living, many turn to informal jobs, street vending, collecting recyclables, or day labor. But these are fragile sources of income, never enough to cover rent in an expensive city like D.C. They lack capital, skills, and even basic training programs to escape the cycle. On a lucky day, they may make enough to buy dinner. On an unlucky one, hunger weighs heavily on an empty stomach again. Behind those jobs lies perpetual instability. A middle-aged man may spend the entire day collecting aluminum cans, only to exchange them for a few dollars, just enough for a loaf of bread and a cheap cup of coffee. An elderly woman may sit for hours on the street with a basket of hand-picked flowers, but most passers-by only glance briefly. The meager coins gathered become the heartbeat that sustains survival, but not enough to open the door out of poverty. In modern society, where opportunity and fairness are praised as core values, the homeless in Washington, D.C. live in a different reality where each day is only a repetition of hunger, insecurity, and despair. They have no sustainable way out, because the system does not give them a ladder to climb up, but only places them inside a closed loop. And that very loop has turned their lives into an equation without a solution. Existence without a future. In the heart of Washington, D.C., among streets filled with tents, there still flickers light from community sharing. Nonprofit organizations, churches, and volunteer groups become makeshift lifelines. At Central Union Mission, hundreds of hot meals are served daily, steam rising into the frigid winter air. Some short for so others might eat provides not only meals, but also clothing, basic medical services, and sometimes simply a smile, a glance that recognizes them as human. These small glimmers give many the strength to get back up after a night spent hurriedly sleeping on cold concrete. Yet, while the community reaches out, the government often chooses a different approach, maintaining order and cleaning the city's appearance. Since 2023, hundreds of encampment clearances have taken place across D.C. Trucks arrive, police stand guard, city workers clear away blankets, tents, sometimes even IDs and medication, the few precious belongings the homeless have. For many, each clearance feels like a theft of life. They lose not only a flimsy roof, but also fragments of memory tucked into an old backpack. Police patrols have also been stepped up, especially in sensitive areas around the White House and Capitol Hill, where the image of the Capitol must appear clean before tourists and the media. Minor violations such as pitching a tent, sleeping on a bench, or panhandling can lead to penalties. Courts permit bans on outdoor sleeping if there are alternative shelters available, but in reality, the number of shelter beds is far from enough. Thus, the cycle continues. Tents are torn down, people are driven away, and then they set up new tents on another street corner. Through these actions, the Capitol's image is beautified a little, but the price is lives pushed further into darkness. The government seems to treat homelessness as an issue of public order management rather than a humanitarian crisis. The tension between preserving the city's image and protecting the basic right to live remains visible every day. Yet amid all these contradictions, there are still ordinary citizens quietly standing with the homeless. Students volunteering to bring blankets to parks, small shop owners willing to give away leftover food, community groups setting up mini libraries so homeless children can read. These simple gestures cannot solve the crisis, but they preserve something most precious: humanity. If statistics reveal the severity of the crisis, then the way society perceives the homeless makes the wound even deeper. In Washington, D.C., they face not only cold, hunger, or instability, but also the heavy weight of prejudice. In news reports, images of the homeless are often tied to drugs, violence, or conflict. Cameras pan across a fight, a discarded syringe, but rarely pause on the weary eyes of a mother trying to keep her child clean inside a small tent. The media, whether intentionally or not, has turned them into a social problem rather than human beings with names, memories, and stories. Cinema is no exception. Occasionally, a film portrays a homeless character, but usually in exaggerated images, the dangerous vagrant, or a hero from the bottom of society who miraculously escapes poverty. Rarely do audiences see the more truthful picture, that the majority of the homeless are not violent. They are merely surviving day by day in scarcity. And the paradox is that the rare success stories and individual overcoming hardship to rise up are often used by society as proof that anyone can do it if they try hard enough. That belief, though seemingly optimistic, unintentionally denies the reality. The system has created barriers that individual effort alone cannot break. Surveys of D.C. residents reveal a bitter truth. The majority of people support clearing tent encampments rather than investing in social housing. To them, the image of makeshift camps is a scratch on the Capitol's face, not a warning sign of policy failure. The homeless are seen as obstacles that must be removed from public space, rather than as neighbors, as citizens worthy of protection. That prejudice seeps into every glance, every whisper. A middle-aged man selling newspapers on the street may be seen as a nuisance, even though it is the only job that keeps him alive day by day. A woman asking for money in a metro station may be judged as lazy, even though in reality she was laid off when her company downsized and has never been able to find new work. Washington, D.C., the capital of freedom and justice, allows these prejudices to exist alongside the symbols of democracy. And those cold stares have helped maintain the vicious cycle. When people are labeled, they lose the chance to be understood, to be handed a ticket back into ordinary life. Within the cold walls of the Capitol, people still ask, is there a way out? The answer, perhaps, lies in the examples from elsewhere, cities and countries that dared to choose a different path to confront the homelessness crisis. In Houston, Texas, within just a decade, the number of homeless people dropped by 60%. This success did not come from a miracle, but from close coordination between government, nonprofits, and the private sector. Instead of chasing after short-term stopgap measures, Houston focused on the principle of one door, all resources gathered at one point of access, ensuring the homeless were not lost in a maze of bureaucracy. The result, thousands found stable housing, and the city proved that when a community works together, dry statistics can become stories of renewal. Looking further, Finland is considered a global model with the philosophy of housing first. There, a home is not a reward for those who prove themselves worthy, but the starting point from which they can rebuild their lives. When people have a safe place to sleep, only then can they gather the strength to find work, the spirit to treat illness, and the hope to reconnect with society. This policy has helped Finland nearly eradicate chronic homelessness, clear evidence that housing is not just shelter from rain and sun, but the foundation of human dignity. Portugal, too, once faced waves of addiction and homelessness. Instead of punishment, they chose to decriminalize drugs, combined with community rehabilitation programs. Addicts are treated as patients, not criminals. And when the weight of criminalization was lifted, many found their way back. Looking at these examples, Washington, D.C. does not seem to lack resources. The city has a large budget, strong infrastructure, and an entire government apparatus at the very center of the nation. What is missing is a long-term coordinated strategy, the courage to overcome political pressure and the objections of the upper class. Because when housing is seen as a basic right, not a privilege, only then can solutions truly take root. The lessons from Houston, Finland, and Portugal are not just stories from faraway places, but reminders that things can be different if we want them to be. The problem is not whether solutions exist, but whether Washington, D.C. dares to choose a more humane and radical path. Washington, D.C., once seen as the land of opportunity, where people from all over came to build new lives. The marble steps of the Capitol once symbolized the belief that anyone could contribute to the shared story of America. But today, on that very same land, thousands are cast aside, huddled in fragile tents beneath the shadows of the halls of power. The cause does not lie only in individuals or in wrong choices, but in the overlapping combination of unjust policies, an inhumane housing market, an incomplete healthcare system, and deep-seated prejudices. The homeless in D.C. are not just isolated lives. They are mirrors reflecting an entire system failing to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Each tent pitched on a sidewalk is not only a symbol of poverty, but also a warning of what is breaking down within society. The responsibility for rebuilding cannot rest only on the shoulders of the government or charities. It requires a root-level change, a combination of political reform, market adjustment, and compassion from the community. Restructuring housing strategy to ensure that shelter is no longer a privilege of the wealthy, improving healthcare and mental health services so that no one is left behind, and most importantly, cross-sector coordination so that each agency and organization does not operate like isolated islands. The homeless must be seen not as outsiders, but as citizens, people with the basic rights promised by the Constitution, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When Washington, D.C., the political center of the world, allows more than 8,000 people to sleep on the streets, this is no longer an individual tragedy, but an indicator of systemic failure. The dream of rebuilding here is not only about constructing more houses or opening more shelters. It is about restoring the belief that this society can be just. It is about demonstrating that even those cast to the margins still deserve a chance to begin again. And that is also the measure of whether America can still preserve the soul of what is called the American dream. Washington, D.C., the so-called heart of global politics, today reflects a bitter paradox. Just a few steps from the White House, from the steps of the Capitol, thousands of people still curl up on freezing sidewalks. A city once considered a symbol of democracy, freedom, and justice now reflects a harsh truth. When the vulnerable are left behind, the concept of justice becomes an empty shell. The homelessness crisis in D.C. is no longer the tragedy of individuals, but the measure of the health of an entire system. It raises an unavoidable question. If a wealthy nation, with immense resources, cannot guarantee the most basic thing for its citizens, a safe home, then does the American dream still exist for everyone? If even in the Capitol, where political power is most concentrated, this issue cannot be resolved, how much harsher will the national picture be? Remember, the homeless are not strangers loitering on sidewalks. They were once veterans who served the country, workers who dedicated their lives to factories, or single mothers exhausted because they could not bear the burden of rent. They once had families, once had dreams, once believed in the future. Recognizing them as citizens with basic rights instead of as burdens is the first step to restoring faith and rebuilding social justice. To bring change, we cannot rely only on the government or a few charities. This is a reform that requires the participation of the entire society, government, businesses, and every individual, because housing should not be a luxury reward for a few, but the foundation from which anyone can begin again. And we as witnesses have a responsibility not to close our eyes. If you believe this truth deserves to be seen, please like, share, and subscribe to spread the message. Every share of yours is one step toward ensuring that the voices of the homeless are not forgotten.